The nursery smelled of fresh linen, powdered herbs, and faint hints of fear. Candles flickered across the pale walls, casting long, dancing shadows over the crib where Master Langston's infant heir slept. Ilara, a young enslaved woman forced into a twisted marriage with the master, moved silently along the edges of the room. To the world, she was obedient, fragile, and compliant, a girl shaped by circumstance and submission. Yet beneath her quiet demeanor lay a mind sharpened by years of suffering, observation, and silent fury. This is the story of how one enslaved bride transformed cruelty into a patient, intelligent plan of vengeance, beginning in the very nursery where life and tyranny intertwined. Before we step further into this tale of calculated justice, where are you watching from tonight? What time is it where you are? Drop a comment, and if stories of patience, strategy, and inevitable retribution captivate you, hit subscribe, because what you are about to hear has been hidden in the shadows of history. Ilara had arrived at the Langston estate in Mississippi at the age of 15, a young woman of quick wit and sharp awareness, though her life offered little outlet for either. The estate, sprawling and suffused with the wealth of cotton and human labor, was ruled with a mixture of intimidation, violence, and carefully maintained cruelty. Master Langston, towering and imperious, treated the world as if it existed solely for his pleasure, exercising dominion over both the estate and its inhabitants. Ilara, forced into the role of bride, learned quickly that survival required careful observation, patience, and the art of invisibility. Her first months were a delicate dance of compliance. She moved silently through the corridors, attended to the mistress's demands, and bore the burdens of pregnancy, humiliation, and constant surveillance. Yet, every day of obedience became an act of intelligence, as she catalogued the routines of her master and the reactions of the household staff. She learned the timing of his inspections, the patterns of his visits to the nursery, and the subtle behaviors that betrayed both vanity and weakness. In her mind, every gesture and every expression was a piece of a puzzle she would one day use to reclaim agency over her life. The nursery became her primary observation post. From the corner where the infant slept, Ilara watched the master interact with the child, noting how he asserted dominance, how he reacted to perceived disobedience, and how his sense of control could be manipulated. She observed the slaves who worked in the household, the cooks, maids, and caretakers who quietly complied with his authority, some out of fear, others out of habit. Through these observations, she began to understand the invisible networks of complicity and influence that ran through the estate, realizing that she could leverage them when the time was right. Master Langston's cruelty was both public and private. He would belittle Ilara in the presence of overseers, yet his private interactions were marked by unpredictable bursts of violence. The nursery, where he felt most entitled, was a stage for both pride and fear. Ilara studied these patterns meticulously, noting how the master's confidence was often built upon predictable assumptions and the unchallenged obedience of those around him. She recognized that while his physical power was formidable, his intelligence could be outmaneuvered by patience, cunning, and precise calculation. As the months progressed, Ilara's endurance sharpened into resolve. She began cataloging small opportunities, the timing of the midwives' visits, the daily routines of the kitchen staff, the predictable moments when the master was distracted or alone. Each observation was stored with the care of a scholar preserving vital knowledge, every detail contributing to a mental blueprint that would guide her eventual act of revenge. Even ordinary objects, the cradle, the toys, the linens, were noted for potential use, their positions and functions recorded with precision in her mind. Ilara's pregnancy, forced as it was, became both a burden and a tool. She learned to move with discretion, using the cover of her duties and the predictable concern of the household for her condition to shield her intentions. The nursery, a place of imposed motherhood and surveillance, became her sanctuary for quiet planning and mental rehearsal. Each day, she rehearsed sequences of actions, envisioned reactions, and tested hypothetical outcomes in her mind. The patient cultivation of knowledge was her weapon, and she wielded it silently, invisibly, and inevitably. Allies among the enslaved workers became increasingly important. She observed which individuals were discreet, capable, and reliable, noting those who understood the subtleties of survival under oppressive authority. Their tacit compliance and subtle assistance delaying tasks, misplacing items, or subtly guiding the master's attention would later become essential in executing her plan. By cultivating trust and observing loyalty, Elara slowly constructed a network that, while unseen by the master, amplified her influence and control over the environment. Even the infant, the unintended witness to the household's dynamics, became part of her strategic consideration. Elara learned to anticipate the master's reactions in the presence of the child, using the routines of care to position herself advantageously. She moved through the nursery with deliberate precision, performing the daily tasks required of her, while simultaneously rehearsing contingencies, planning interventions, and observing every nuance of the master's behavior. Each moment of compliance was a thread woven into a broader tapestry of eventual justice. By the evening, as the estate fell into the familiar rhythm of quiet corridors, lantern-lit hallways, and distant sounds from the fields, Elara sat in the shadowed corner of the nursery. Her hands rested lightly on the crib rail, but her mind was alive with observation, calculation, and determination. Every act of cruelty she had endured, every insult catalogued, every opportunity noted over years of forced submission, had prepared her for the inevitable day when intelligence, patience, and strategic planning would transform her circumstances into instruments of retribution. In the silence of the nursery, under the watchful glow of candlelight, Elara's mind crystallized the inevitability of what was to come. She was no longer merely a victim, no longer simply a servant. She was a strategist, a silent architect of vengeance, and a patient observer whose intelligence would turn 20 years of suffering into calculated justice. The stage was being set. Every person, every object, every behavior had its role, and the night of reckoning would arrive precisely when all conditions aligned. The days in the Langston household continued with a deceptive rhythm, each one blending cruelty, routine, and the illusion of order. To the master and overseers, Elara remained the obedient, compliant, enslaved bride, a figure molded into apparent submission. Her presence was unremarkable, her movements measured and predictable. Yet beneath this veneer of compliance, Elara's mind was active, absorbing every detail, cataloging every nuance of behavior, and observing the minute interactions that revealed the true architecture of control within the estate. This was the work of silent intelligence, patient, deliberate, and methodical, and it was here, in the shadows of the nursery and household, that Elara laid the foundation for the ultimate act of vengeance. She watched her master with a scholar's eye, noting the arrogance, pride, and predictable habits that he considered strengths. Every command issued to the staff, every gesture of frustration, every moment of indulgent cruelty, provided insight into his vulnerabilities. The master assumed his authority was unassailable, his control absolute, yet his reliance on predictable patterns became a tool for Elara to exploit. By noting the timing of his inspections, the way he walked through the halls, and the manner in which he asserted dominance over both the enslaved and the environment, she began mapping a comprehensive strategy that could turn his own predictability against him. The nursery, once a place of confinement and surveillance, became Elara's observation post. From the corner of the room, she studied the interactions between the master, the infant, and the staff, noting minute reactions that revealed hidden fears, frustrations, and dependencies. How the master adjusted his tone when the overseer entered, how he monitored the movements of his guests, and how he reacted when things deviated from his expectations, all became critical data points in her growing mental map. The subtle misalignments of his ego, the blind spots in his perception, were carefully recorded for later use. Beyond the nursery, Elara began observing the other enslaved workers. Some were compliant out of fear, others out of habit, but all could be influenced subtly to support her eventual plan. She tested their reactions with minor cues: a glance, a whispered word, a small deviation from routine gauging loyalty, intelligence, and courage. These quiet experiments allowed her to identify allies who could act discreetly in the future, whose complicity would amplify the inevitability of her revenge without ever revealing her intentions. Each person became a potential instrument in the carefully orchestrated sequence that would culminate years later. She also began cataloging the physical environment. Hallways, doors, furniture, and nursery implements were all mentally mapped for strategic use. The placement of a crib, the alignment of toys, the positioning of a rocking chair all became potential tools to manipulate the master's movements or to control the environment during the decisive moment. Even small objects, previously considered mundane, were analyzed for their potential utility in the orchestration of her vengeance. Ilara's mind treated the household itself as a chessboard, each component with a role in a complex, long-term strategy. Daily routines were scrutinized with precision. She memorized when the master would visit the nursery, how long he lingered, and the specific routes he preferred to take. She noted when the overseers were distracted or inattentive, identifying moments that could later be exploited. Even the timing of the infant's cries, the staff's chores, and the lighting of candles were mentally recorded, each moment carefully considered for its potential role in the eventual execution of her plan. Patience became the cornerstone of her strategy. She understood that impulsive action would destroy the careful architecture she had constructed over months of observation. The cruelty Ilara endured became both a teacher and a motivator. Each insult, each violent outburst, and each moment of degradation reinforced the necessity of patient intelligence. She learned to endure without breaking, to observe without reacting, and to convert suffering into actionable insight. The seed of vengeance was nourished by the accumulation of knowledge, awareness, and subtle influence, all building toward a future moment in which justice could be exacted with precision. By the third year, Ilara had developed a system of mental codes, small cues and signals that could coordinate action without revealing intent. A misaligned toy, a delayed response, a glance toward a particular corner all communicated layers of meaning to those she had identified as reliable allies. These silent codes would become essential during the decisive act, allowing the enslaved workers to participate in the orchestration of justice while preserving their own safety and anonymity. The master remained unaware of the quiet transformation occurring around him. His overconfidence, rooted in arrogance and habitual reliance on obedience, blinded him to the meticulous preparations unfolding within his household. Every observation, every subtle intervention, every piece of mental mapping was invisible to him, yet each contributed directly to the inevitability of his eventual downfall. Ilara's patient study of human behavior and environmental control had created an invisible lattice of power, with herself at the apex, waiting for the moment when it would converge into action. Nightfall brought the usual routines. The infant lulled to sleep, staff completing chores, and the master retiring to his private chambers, confident in the stability of his authority. Ilara, in the shadows of the nursery, cataloged the day's observations, noted subtle behavioral patterns, and rehearsed potential sequences of action in her mind. Every interaction, every minor disruption, every quietly noted vulnerability became another component in the meticulous framework she was building. Patience, intelligence, and observation had become her tools, her weapons, and her path to justice. As the candles flickered and the estate fell into a deceptive quiet, Ilara understood the depth of her patience and the inevitability of her plan. Each day of silent observation, each moment of endured cruelty, had contributed to the construction of a strategy that would one day be executed with precision. She was no longer merely a victim, no longer a passive participant in her own oppression. She was an architect of inevitable justice, a patient strategist whose intelligence and careful observation would ultimately transform suffering into retribution. By the fourth year of her forced life as Master Langston's bride, Ilara's mind had evolved into a precise instrument of strategy. The abuse she endured, the humiliation she carried, and the intimate knowledge of the household had all become tools for the formulation of a calculated plan. She had learned to map the estate, understand the psychology of the master, and observe the subtle alliances and loyalties of her fellow enslaved workers. Every minor detail when the master paused in his routines, how the household reacted to his whims, and which doors could be manipulated, was catalogued for a night that would eventually become the culmination of years of patient observation and careful orchestration. Ilara began to formulate the architecture of her revenge, tying each element to the predictable arrogance and cruelty of Master Langston. She understood that impulsive action would fail. Only meticulous planning, combined with precise timing and subtle manipulation of both people and environment, could yield absolute control. The nursery, once a space of oppression and enforced maternal duties, became the central axis of her strategy. From this vantage point, she could control movement within the house, influence the behaviors of both the master and the household staff, and stage the act of vengeance with unparalleled precision. Her tools were both ordinary and extraordinary. Everyday objects, the crib, toys, feeding utensils, and linens were evaluated for their potential to be used in subversive ways. Even seemingly trivial details, such as the alignment of a rocking chair or the placement of a candle, became critical considerations. Poisoning herbs were studied, dosage calculated in secret over months, and hidden in containers no one would suspect. Ilara considered contingencies. If a door failed to close, if a horse panicked, if the master moved unpredictably. Each variable was anticipated and accounted for, ensuring that her plan was not left to chance. Allies among the enslaved workers were identified and subtly prepared. Some were trusted to provide minor diversions or misdirect the overseers. Others were instructed in silent, coded signals. The network of quiet complicity became integral to the plan, ensuring that even actions performed indirectly would contribute to the inevitable outcome. These collaborators understood that their participation, though invisible, would be essential to the success of Ilara's carefully orchestrated retribution. Every glance, every small gesture, every moment of feigned compliance became part of the broader choreography of revenge. Psychological manipulation became a cornerstone of her strategy. Ilara had learned the patterns of Master Langston's attention, his predictability in moments of pride, and the triggers that incited both cruelty and overconfidence. She understood his over-reliance on routine, his assumption that obedience equated to submission, and his blind spots when it came to her intelligence and resolve. By exploiting these vulnerabilities, Ilara could create conditions under which the master would move toward the very instruments of his downfall without suspicion. Nightly rehearsals in her mind became the blueprint of inevitability. Ilara imagined each step, each placement, each reaction. She simulated the timing of servants, the positioning of household items, and the anticipated confusion of the master during critical moments. Her plan was built upon observation and reinforced by patience, each layer meticulously constructed to ensure that, when the time came, every component would function seamlessly. The nursery, once a space of forced subservience, was transformed into a strategic hub from which control could be exerted over the household without detection. Ilara's patience extended beyond the physical and psychological mapping of the estate. It encompassed the long-term cultivation of her own endurance. She maintained a calm exterior, enduring the indignities of her forced marriage, the abuse of Master Langston, and the relentless demands of the household. Each insult, each act of cruelty, was stored in memory, feeding the clarity and determination of her eventual retribution. Her intelligence allowed her to convert these experiences into actionable insight, each moment of suffering refining the precision of her plan. Even the children and servants became part of her mental map. She observed the baby's routines, the reactions of the nannies, and the predictable patterns of household staff. She understood how to use these dynamics to guide movement, create distractions, and manipulate the environment in subtle ways that would amplify the inevitability of her revenge. Each actor in the household, knowingly or unknowingly, was a component in a strategy designed to reshape power, exact justice, and convert decades of suffering into precise retribution. By the evening, as the estate settled into its nightly rhythm, Ilara reflected on the meticulousness of her plan. Every object, every routine, every person's behavior had been observed, catalogued, and integrated into a framework that would one day allow her to act with complete control. The patience she had cultivated over years, the intelligence honed by observation, and the subtle manipulation of her environment converged in her mind into a blueprint for vengeance that was inevitable, precise, and devastating in its execution. Ilara had transformed from a victim of cruelty into a strategist, a master of observation, and an architect of inevitable justice. The nursery, the household, the master's predictable arrogance, and the silent complicity of trusted allies were all aligned in her mental choreography. The night of reckoning was still years away, but the foundation was complete. Patience, intelligence, and meticulous planning would converge to deliver justice with the inevitability of a carefully orchestrated symphony, and the household that had long oppressed her would soon learn that the consequences of cruelty were patient, deliberate, and unstoppable. By the 5th year of her forced marriage, Ilara's patience and planning had matured into action, though only in subtle, nearly imperceptible forms. To the master, she remained compliant, obedient, and fragile, an image carefully maintained. Yet behind the calm exterior, Ilara orchestrated a series of minor disruptions throughout the household, all designed to test reactions, build momentum, and prepare the environment for the eventual night of reckoning. These acts were never impulsive. Each was calculated, deliberate, and part of a broader strategy that had been silently unfolding for years. Ilara began with small interventions in the nursery, the room that had become both her sanctuary and strategic command center. Toys were shifted slightly, blankets misaligned, and the timing of infant care subtly altered. Each act seemed innocuous to the master and staff, yet it generated micro-confusions and delays that allowed her to observe responses and refine her understanding of human behavior under stress. Even the faintest hesitation or misstep was catalogued, forming a mental blueprint of control that would be indispensable in the coming climax of her plan. The other enslaved workers were drawn into this subtle sabotage, though none realized the full scope of her ultimate intent. A maid might accidentally misplace a feeding bottle, a nurse might delay a meal, a cook might misalign utensils, all in ways that appeared natural, yet collectively contributed to an environment of latent disruption. Their tacit complicity, though subtle, amplified the inevitability of the eventual act. Every small error and hesitation in the household became a component in a meticulously constructed choreography that only Ilara could see in full. Ilara also began testing the master's reactions. Minor disruptions allowed her to gauge his patience, arrogance, and predictability. She noted when he became irritated by delays, how he responded to disorder in the nursery, and which patterns of control were most vulnerable to manipulation. His overconfidence worked against him. Each misstep, each moment of subtle confusion, reinforced the idea that the household was orderly and secure, blinding him to the deliberate manipulations shaping the environment. The nursery's objects, once instruments of care, became tools of influence. Crib rails, rocking chairs, and blankets were repositioned strategically, not to cause harm but to guide behavior, distract attention, or create necessary openings during the final act. Each object's placement was carefully considered, rehearsed mentally, and subtly adjusted as circumstances demanded. These minor alterations were almost invisible to the untrained eye, yet they laid the groundwork for the precise control required to manipulate the master at the critical moment. The psychological dimension of sabotage was equally important. Ilara subtly influenced the behaviors of the master's guests, the overseers, and the household staff. A whispered suggestion here, a delayed action there, a glance exchanged with an ally all reinforced the underlying framework of control she had been constructing for years. Each interaction was a test, each observation a data point, and each subtle disruption a rehearsal for the decisive orchestration that would eventually unfold. Ilara's intelligence allowed her to predict the likely outcomes of these subtle interventions. She could anticipate how the master would react to a missing object, a misaligned chair, or a delayed task. Each reaction was catalogued, allowing her to refine the timing, placement, and coordination necessary for the ultimate act of revenge. Her patient manipulation of the environment ensured that when the night of reckoning arrived, every variable had been considered, every reaction anticipated, and every ally positioned to participate or remain silent in support of her plan. Despite the apparent mundanity of these acts, they carried enormous significance. Each small disruption destabilized the master's sense of control, creating psychological tension that amplified the effectiveness of her eventual revenge. To the outside observer, the household continued its routine, appearing orderly and obedient. Yet beneath the surface, Ilara's patient manipulations had shifted the balance of power subtly but irreversibly, laying the groundwork for the inevitable confrontation that would one day deliver justice. As night fell over the Langston estate, the nursery became a quiet theater of observation. Candles flickered along the walls, illuminating the careful arrangements of objects and the positions of silent allies among the staff. Alara reviewed the day's minor disruptions, noting their outcomes and refining strategies for future interventions. Each misstep by the master or minor confusion among the household staff was integrated into her mental blueprint, reinforcing the inevitability of her plan. The master, unaware of the quiet sabotage surrounding him, retired to his chambers confident in the stability of his authority. Ilara's exterior remained calm, her actions unremarkable, yet the invisible lattice of control she had woven, through subtle sabotage and strategic observation, ensured that the household itself would serve as the stage for his eventual downfall. Years of patience, intelligence, and calculated manipulation had created a situation where the master's own environment, routine, and predictability were the instruments of his undoing. By the end of the evening, Ilara sat quietly in the nursery, cataloging the day's small disruptions and rehearsing sequences in her mind. Every object, every routine, every subtle interaction had contributed to the architecture of inevitability. The night of reckoning was approaching, and the household, oblivious to the patience, intelligence, and deliberate manipulation that had been quietly unfolding, was moving toward an outcome that was precise, unavoidable, and perfectly orchestrated. The night descended over the Langston estate like a suffocating velvet shroud, thick with humidity and the scent of damp earth. Lanterns swung in the halls, casting trembling shadows that flickered across the nursery walls, highlighting the careful placement of every crib, blanket, and toy that Ilara had studied for years. The estate was quiet, the staff immersed in routine, and the master, confident in his control, retired to the nursery to inspect his infant heir. All appeared normal, orderly, and obedient. Yet beneath the surface, the carefully orchestrated plan that had taken years of observation, patience, and subtle sabotage was ready to unfold. The night of reckoning had arrived. Ilara moved with measured precision, her movements deliberate, her presence unnoticed by those around her. Every step had been rehearsed, every action timed to perfection. The nursery, once a place of confinement and oppression, had become the strategic command center from which she would execute her long-planned vengeance. Poisoned items, strategically placed objects, and carefully timed distractions were all set into motion. Allies among the enslaved workers remained in the shadows, each aware of their role in silent complicity, prepared to act or observe as necessary to ensure the plan's success without drawing attention to themselves. The master entered the nursery, his arrogance and confidence unshaken, unaware that the very environment he controlled had been subtly manipulated against him. Ilara had prepared for every possible reaction. Every gesture, every glance, and every movement he made had been anticipated. The ropes, hidden tools, and nursery implements, all seemingly innocuous, were now positioned to guide, restrict, and control him. The culmination of years of patient observation was within reach, and the moment was executed with the precision of a skilled strategist. Allies participated silently. A misplaced bottle, a quietly delayed candle lighting, a subtle obstruction of a door all amplified the psychological tension and disorientation of the master. The enslaved workers' subtle, coordinated interventions reinforced the inevitability of the outcome. No single act revealed intent. Instead, the orchestration created an environment where the master's own arrogance and predictability facilitated the execution of justice. The network of complicity ensured that each element functioned harmoniously, leaving no trace of Ilara's direct involvement while maximizing the impact of her carefully calculated plan. The sequence unfolded exactly as Marcus had envisioned, though it was Ilara's intellect, patience, and meticulous planning that orchestrated the events. The master, tied metaphorically to his own habits and literal constraints, reacted predictably to the subtle manipulations in the room. Every pause, every hesitation, every instinctive attempt at control played directly into the strategic setup she had constructed over years. The household's daily routines, once instruments of oppression, had been inverted to serve the inevitability of his downfall. The infant, the silent witness of years of cruelty, remained unharmed yet central to the orchestration. Its predictable cries and scheduled care created opportunities for diversions, allowing Alara to execute the most delicate aspects of her plan with precision. Every movement, every object, every participant in the room had been calculated to produce maximum effect with minimal risk of exposure. The nursery, the symbol of forced subjugation and control, had been transformed into the stage upon which the master's undoing would occur. Hours passed, each moment reinforcing the inevitability of the plan's success. The master's confusion, frustration, and panic were the product of subtle manipulations executed over years, now converging into a single, decisive event. Alara remained calm, her intellect guiding every motion, her patience ensuring that the act of vengeance was deliberate rather than impulsive. The culmination was precise, unflinching, and irrevocable, a perfect intersection of strategy, observation, and execution. By dawn, the master had been neutralized. The nursery's environment returned to apparent order, and the enslaved allies had retreated to their daily routines, leaving no direct evidence of involvement. The estate, superficially unchanged, bore invisible marks of the night's events. The subtle shifts in power, the quiet acknowledgement of Alara's intelligence, and the unmistakable demonstration that patience and careful planning could overturn tyranny. The household, previously dominated by fear and cruelty, had experienced an irreversible transformation, an assertion of justice executed with precision, subtlety, and patient observation. Alara herself remained calm, collected, and undetected. Her patience, intelligence, and foresight had allowed her to convert suffering into action, cruelty into calculated justice. The master's downfall was not impulsive or chaotic. It was inevitable, orchestrated with the precision of someone who had endured, observed, and waited for decades. The night had demonstrated the power of strategy, patience, and subtle manipulation, a testament to the intellect and resilience of one woman against the tyranny of a master who had underestimated her. As the first light of dawn filtered through the nursery windows, Alara sat quietly, observing the aftermath. The household continued its routines superficially, yet the balance of power had shifted irreversibly. The silent complicity of her allies, the meticulous manipulation of objects and routines, and the patient orchestration of every detail had created an outcome that was precise, inevitable, and unforgettable. Her revenge, executed with intelligence and patience, had become a living lesson in the power of careful strategy over brute force. Dawn broke over the Langston estate, carrying with it the soft mist of a southern morning and a deceptive calm. The nursery, which had witnessed decades of oppression, was now silent and ordered, yet beneath the surface lay the imprint of calculated justice executed with patient precision. The master, once a figure of unquestioned authority, was no longer the center of control. His arrogance and cruelty had been neutralized by the very instruments he had underestimated. Alara, the enslaved bride whose suffering had been invisible to all, had transformed patience, intelligence, and careful observation into action with irreversible consequences. The immediate aftermath was a mixture of shock and hushed speculation among the household staff and neighboring plantations. Whispers circulated. Some suggested an accident, others murmured of divine retribution, and a few suspected subtle sabotage. No one, however, could trace the orchestration back to Alara. Her patient manipulation of routines, objects, and allies had left no direct evidence, ensuring both her safety and the inevitability of her plan's success. The enslaved workers who had been quietly complicit returned to their routines, their silence both a shield and a testament to the collective intelligence that had enabled this act of justice. Alara herself disappeared soon after, adopting a new identity and leaving the estate under the cover of early morning mist. Her movements were calculated, each step rehearsed to avoid detection. The network of quiet allies remained behind, safeguarding her secret while maintaining the appearance of compliance to the outside world. Their tacit understanding ensured that the household's new reality remained unchallenged, while Alara's strategy became a legend whispered in the quarters and beyond. The subtle orchestration of years had created a ripple effect. Fear, respect, and the acknowledgement of intelligence over brute force spread throughout the surrounding estates. The nursery, once a symbol of domination and surveillance, had become the center of her calculated revenge. Every object, cribs, blankets, toys, feeding implements, had played a role in the orchestration of justice, demonstrating the power of observation and patient manipulation. The enslaved allies' subtle cooperation had amplified her influence without revealing her hand, proving that intelligence, patience, and careful orchestration could transform the environment itself into a tool of justice. The estate continued its daily routines, but the psychological landscape had been permanently altered. Over time, Ilara's story, though never openly told, became a whispered legend among the enslaved community. She was remembered not merely as a woman who enacted revenge, but as a strategist whose intelligence, patience, and meticulous observation had enabled her to convert years of suffering into precise action. The narrative emphasized the inevitability of her plan, the careful manipulation of environment and allies, and the precise timing that had ensured success. Her name became synonymous with patience, strategy, and the transformative power of calculated action. Beyond the estate, the Langston family's disappearance served as a cautionary tale for neighboring masters. Arrogance, overconfidence, and the underestimation of the enslaved could result in consequences that were invisible until executed. The ripple of fear and uncertainty spread, and the silent strategic power of the enslaved community became more apparent. Kitchens, nurseries, and stables were approached with renewed caution, and the awareness that patience and intelligence could overturn tyranny persisted long after the events themselves. Ilara herself traveled discreetly through the region, maintaining a new identity while observing the social and power structures she had left behind. The knowledge she had accumulated about routines, vulnerabilities, and human behavior remained her shield and her tool. Her patience, cultivated over years of suffering, had produced not only vengeance but also a demonstration of the power of foresight, intelligence, and strategic planning. She became invisible in plain sight, a symbol of deliberate and intelligent retribution whose presence was felt but never confirmed. Decades later, whispers of her actions persisted, stories of a young enslaved woman who had transformed cruelty into calculated justice, using the nursery, the routines, and the silent complicity of allies as instruments of vengeance. The lesson endured. Patience, intelligence, and observation could overturn brute force, transform suffering into action, and assert justice in ways that brute strength alone could never achieve. Ilara's legacy was subtle but profound, a testament to the enduring power of the patient mind, the strategic heart, and the quiet orchestration of inevitability. In every corner of the estates she left behind, in the whispers of those who had witnessed or heard of her actions, and in the silent acknowledgement of those who survived the household's tyranny, Ilara's story endured. The nursery, once a space of oppression, remained a symbol of patient intelligence, careful planning, and the transformative force of a mind honed by suffering. The estate itself, though seemingly unchanged, carried the invisible signature of her calculated vengeance, and the legacy of her strategy, patience, and intelligence became a quiet but enduring mark upon history.